1961 marked the dawn of a new musical era. These forgotten classics define your generation, while the world changed forever. Patsy Cline's "I Fall to Pieces" emerged from one of the most controversial moments in country music history. Nashville producers initially refused to let Cline record the song, believing female artists couldn't sell records addressing romantic heartbreak so directly. Born Virginia Patterson Hensley in 1932, Cline fought against industry sexism her entire career. She famously told producer Owen Bradley, "The only pieces I'm falling to are the pieces of your career if you don't let me record this song." Bradley relented, though he insisted on heavy string orchestration to soften her image. What makes Cline's success all the more remarkable is that "I Fall to Pieces" was recorded shortly after a near-fatal car accident that left her hospitalized for a month with a severe head injury. She performed on crutches for months afterward. Had Cline lived, she died in a plane crash in 1963 at just 30 years old, she would have been the first female country artist to headline her own world tour, something that was in the planning stages at the time of her passing. Her legacy continues through the Patsy Cline Museum in Nashville, which opened in 2017 and houses the largest collection of Cline's personal artifacts and memorabilia. During the recording session for "I Fall to Pieces," Cline became so frustrated with Bradley's production approach that she stormed out of the studio. The tape that was eventually released features her returning after a 30-minute absence, during which she drank whiskey in her car. The emotional rawness in her voice that fans have loved for decades was actually barely controlled anger at her producer. The Highwaymen delivered "Michael," a folk ballad with disturbing undertones that radio stations initially hesitated to play. Formed at Wesleyan University in 1958, this collegiate folk group had nothing to do with the later supergroup of the same name featuring Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson. Their harmonies may have sounded innocent, but "Michael" tells the story of a man who drowns himself, making it one of the earliest hit songs to address suicide. Radio programmers debated banning it, but its catchy melody masked the dark lyrics enough to slip past censors. After their brief moment of fame, the Highwaymen found themselves in a lengthy battle with Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, and Chris Christopherson, who wanted to use the name for their supergroup in the 1980s. The original Highwaymen eventually settled, receiving a financial payment and the right to be billed as the original Highwaymen for performances. Most members went on to conventional careers outside music, though Dave Fisher continued performing and arranging music for television until his passing in 2010. The group occasionally reunited for college alumni events, with their last performance coming in 2002. Michael gained unexpected notoriety in 1980 when a psychology journal published a study claiming the song had inspired several copycat suicides in the 1960s. While the research methodology was later discredited, the controversy reignited interest in the song and led to its inclusion in several documentaries about censorship in popular music. Hey friends, share your memories in the comments. Your stories matter, and we want to hear them. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next week's Forgotten Classics. Roy Orbison's "Crying" showcased his 3-octave vocal range at a time when most male vocalists kept to a narrow, safer range.
It's so long, left me standing.
He was born in Texas in 1936, and Orbison struggled with severe stage fright and insecurity about his appearance throughout his career. His signature dark sunglasses weren't a fashion statement, but a necessity after he left his regular glasses on a plane and was forced to wear prescription sunglasses for a performance. The audience reaction was so positive that he continued wearing them, eventually making them part of his mystique. Behind those glasses, Orbison was fighting depression triggered by personal tragedies that would have ended most careers. Few artists have experienced the level of personal tragedy that Orbison endured. His first wife, Claudette, died in a motorcycle accident in 1966, and 2 years later, 2 of his 3 children died in a house fire while he was touring. Orbison continued to perform throughout these devastating losses, often breaking down backstage after performances. His career revival came in the late 1980s when he joined the supergroup the Traveling Wilburys alongside Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. Their collaboration reintroduced Orbison to a new generation, just before his death from a heart attack in 1988. His posthumous album, Mystery Girl, featured contributions from Bono, Elvis Costello, and Tom Petty, demonstrating the deep respect fellow musicians had for him. When Orbison first performed Crying on TV, the cameraman was so moved by his performance that the camera noticeably shakes during the song's climax. Footage of this performance was believed lost until 2005, when it was discovered in a mislabeled box in the NBC archives. Elvis Presley once called Orbison the greatest singer in the world, and allegedly refused to go on stage after Orbison performed at a shared concert in the early 1960s. Del Shannon's Runaway pioneered the use of the Musitron, an early electronic keyboard that created the distinctive bridge sound that set the record apart from anything else on radio at the time. Born Charles Westover in Michigan in 1934, Shannon worked as a carpet salesman and truck driver before his music career took off. His manager initially tried to convince him to change his name to Lance Fortune, which Shannon rejected as too phony. What most people don't know is that Shannon battled alcohol addiction throughout his success, often performing while severely intoxicated during his early tours. Shannon's career took a surprising turn when he became one of the first American artists to cover Beatles songs, recognizing their potential before they had broken through in the U.S. His version of From Me to You charted in America months before the Beatles had their first U.S. hit. Despite his early success, Shannon struggled to adapt to changing musical tastes. He suffered from depression and alcoholism for much of his life, eventually committing suicide in 1990 while taking the antidepressant Prozac. His death led to one of the first major lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies for inadequate warnings about suicidal thoughts as a side effect. Shannon was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame posthumously in 1999, with Billy Joel giving the induction speech. Runaway almost never happened because the recording engineer accidentally set the tape recorder to the wrong speed during the session. When played back, the song was a half step higher than performed, giving Shannon's already high voice an even more distinctive sound. Rather than re-record, Shannon decided he liked the effect and kept it, creating the song's unmistakable tension and urgency. If these songs take you back to better days, don't keep those memories to yourself. Hit subscribe now and share this video with your old buddies and tell us about your stories in the comments. Chubby Checker's Pony Time capitalized on the dance craze phenomenon he helped create with the twist. But few people know that Checker, born Ernest Evans in 1941, resented being pigeonholed as a dance instructor rather than a serious musician. His stage name was created as a play on Fats Domino, Chubby Fats, Checker Domino, a marketing decision he later called the first step in becoming a product instead of an artist. Behind the scenes, Checker fought with his record label for the right to record ballads and blues numbers, requests that were repeatedly denied as executives insisted he stick with dance songs. Despite his image as a clean-cut entertainer, Checker struggled with the constraints placed on black performers in the early 1960s. He was expected to maintain a non-threatening persona while performing music with overtly sexual undertones. The hip movements and dances like the pony were considered scandalous by conservative audiences. After his chart success faded in the mid-1960s, Checker continued touring relentlessly, sometimes performing over 200 shows per year. He experienced a brief comeback in the 1980s with a rap version of The Twist, and has continued performing into his 80s. In recent years, Checker has become vocal about what he sees as a lack of recognition from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which has yet to induct him despite his cultural impact. Checker's famous line, "It's Pony Time," wasn't planned, but was an improvised response to the energy in the studio. The recording session for Pony Time happened at the end of an exhausting day when Checker had already recorded 7 other songs. Engineers were ready to pack up when Checker insisted on one more take, resulting in the version that became the hit. He completed the entire song in a single take because the studio couldn't afford to pay the musicians for overtime. Joe Dowell's Wooden Heart became a hit in America after Elvis Presley's version was withheld from U.S. release.
Can't you see I love you? Please don't break my heart in two.
Born in Bloomington, Indiana in 1940, Dowell signed with Smash Records and recorded the song as a demo to showcase his voice, never expecting it to be released. The record company rushed it out when they learned that Elvis's version would only be released in Europe. Dowell often joked that he owed his career to Elvis's manager Colonel Parker's greed. Behind his clean-cut image, Dowell harbored deep resentment toward the music industry, particularly after disputes with his record label led them to shelving his follow-up recordings. After his brief moment of fame, Dowell left the music industry and worked in radio and television production. He occasionally performed at Elvis tribute events, though he expressed mixed feelings about being forever linked to Presley. In his later years, Dowell became deeply religious and wrote Christian-themed songs that received limited distribution. He suffered a stroke in 2012 that ended his ability to perform, and he passed away in 2016 at the age of 76. Despite having a #1 hit, Dowell's musical legacy remains largely overlooked in discussions of early 1960s pop music, something he addressed with both humor and bitterness in interviews late in his life. Bobby Lewis burst onto the scene with Tossin' and Turnin' after years of performing in obscurity.
Couldn't sleep at all last night.
Born in Indianapolis in 1933, Lewis spent his childhood bouncing between foster homes before finding his voice in Detroit's vibrant R&B scene. What many fans don't know is that Lewis initially rejected the song that would become his signature hit. Producer Bobby Robinson had to convince him to record it, leading to a heated argument that almost ended their professional relationship before it truly began. Lewis disappeared from the charts almost as quickly as he arrived. Despite Tossin' and Turning selling over 1 million copies and becoming 1961's best-selling single, Lewis struggled to replicate that success. His follow-up singles barely cracked the top 40, and by the mid-60s, major labels had lost interest. Lewis continued performing in small venues until the early 2000s, occasionally appearing at oldies festivals where fans would react with surprise that he was still alive. His later years were spent in relative obscurity in New Jersey, where he passed away in 2020 at the age of 87. The recording session for Tossin' and Turnin' was completed in just 2 takes, an almost unheard-of feat at the time. Lewis claimed he was battling a cold that day, which gave his voice the distinctive raspy quality that made the record stand out. That accidental vocal style would later influence singers from Joe Cocker to Rod Stewart, though Lewis rarely received credit for his contribution to rock vocal techniques. The sounds of 1960 captured a generation in transition. Share this video with friends who remember these classics, and subscribe for more forgotten hits, and let's keep this musical history alive.